Hello and welcome to Music City Murder, a podcast meant to give people an insight into the history behind Nashville's most infamous murders. The show is hosted by author T. Blake Brady. You can find his novels at Parnassus Books in Green Hills, as well as on Amazon. Fans of James Lee Burke's Dave Robichaux series will probably dig these books too. One last thing before we begin. If you like what you hear, be sure to rate and review Music City Murder on the Apple Podcasts app. It's the little purple icon on your phone. Reviews help to distinguish the show from millions of other podcasts out there. A 5-star review is appreciated, but it doesn't matter what you say. No one is sure how it helps, but it definitely does. It has something to do with the algorithm, I think. Anyway, let's get on to the show.
Welcome. As the intro says, you are listening to Music City Murder, a podcast about the most violent, unexplainable, and gut-wrenching events in Nashville's 200-year history. This episode takes us back to 1960s Nashville, specifically April 1963. General Hospital was just premiered on ABC. The novelty tune Yakety Sax hits number 1 on the charts, and Jack Nicklaus has just become the youngest golfer to win the Masters. Lawrence of Arabia just won Best Picture. Gregory Peck wins an Oscar for Best Actor, and you guessed it, To Kill a Mockingbird. And Anne Bancroft wins for her role in The Miracle Worker. I could go on, but let's not get too bogged down in nostalgia. We have a murder to cover. Now, this episode's going to be a little bit brief. It's not a long... I am sort of unraveled by doing the sort of long-form episodes. So I'm going to do a few that have been kind of hanging around on the docket for a little while. And this one has been on my radar since I started the podcast. It's one of the ones that made me want to do Music City Murder in the first place. So I'm going to savor this one, as it were. So... we're going to start on this episode. Before I begin, I just wanted to remind everybody, if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe and write a review on Apple Podcasts. I know that it says that in the intro, but if you skip the intro, I'm just getting one more in there. Make sure you subscribe, write a review, go to the Apple Podcast app, scroll down to the bottom, and write a review. Those all help distinguish us from all the other podcasts out there. So... now back to the episode. We're going to start with a man named Larry Brinton. Anyone who's spent a significant amount of time in Nashville, especially in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, probably remember Larry Brinton. But in April 1963, Brinton is a young reporter covering the crime and police beat for the Nashville Banner. He's had a long and storied career since then as a journalist. While working for the Banner, he covered the Nashville sit-ins of the 1960s, the fatal plane crash that took the life of famed singer Patsy Cline, and the disappearance and death of Marsha Trimble, which we've covered on the podcast. He also secured the confession of one of David Stringbean Aikman's killers as well. And again, we've covered that. So if you want to hear more about Larry Brinton's role in that case, go back to episodes 1 and 2, and you'll get everything you need about the death of Stringbean from Hee Haw. After leaving the newspaper in the 1970s, Larry Brinton went on to become an investigative reporter for News Channel 5 and cover cases like the Janet Marsh disappearance, which we will do someday on the podcast. Anyway, for now, he's a young, dogged reporter, and he's awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning by a phone call, which is nothing unusual for him. He's accustomed to being torn from sleep in the middle of the night to cover this crime or that one. On the phone is the police dispatcher, Henry Gleaves. There's something going on out on Harding Road, right up the street from the Belle Meade Theater. The house number is 4215 Harding Road. That's my imagination of Henry Gleaves's phone call. The dispatcher tells him that homicide and Dr. Core are on their way. Dr. Core is W.J. Core, the county medical examiner. Core is never summoned to a crime scene unless someone is dead. Brinton realizes then that there's something strange up with this one. Being on the crime beat, he goes to virtually all of the murders, suicides, even accidental deaths, day or night. The residence at 4215 is just past the Belmead Theater on Harding Pike. The theater itself is a historic-looking landmark, even today. Opening in 1940, the 1,100-seat venue screened countless movies and featured hundreds of in-person celebrities over the decades. Ronald Reagan, Bela Lugosi, and Walt Disney are among the 200 signatures gracing the theater's Wall of Fame. Sadly, the theater closed in February of 1991, with its final movie being the hugely disappointing third entry in the Godfather franchise. Reportedly, the signed marble slabs that make up the Wall of Fame are currently in storage at the Tennessee State Museum, and I'm not sure what's happening inside the theater right now. I know it was converted into a bookstore called Bookstar for a time, but at present, I believe it's just an empty space. Anyway, let's head on down the road a ways. Larry Brinton pulls into the driveway of an enormous two-story mansion with huge white columns flanking a front porch and dozens of large trees shading an expansive lot. Stone columns rise from either side of the driveway. The young reporter pulls into the parking area just behind the residence, and he's just been beaten to the spot by medical examiner Dr. Core. Core is a short, heavy-set man who wears wire-rimmed glasses way down on his nose. And despite his grim title, he's apparently got a pretty good sense of humor about his work. When you've seen as much death as this man, perhaps it's the only way to survive. Brinton tags along into the house with the medical examiner. "What you got, Doc?" Brinton asks. "Don't know yet," the doctor replies, shrugging. The home's interior is as decadent as the front facade would imply. Wall-to-wall antiques, paintings, and expensive carpets. Two homicide detectives, Ernest Castleman and Benton Hicks, are perched in front of the bedroom doors along with John Cole, an investigator for the District Attorney General, Harry Nichols. Living at the residence at the time is the Wilson family, 50-year-old John B. Wilson and his wife, Jean Beasley Cochran. Wilson is a longtime Nashvilleian. He had lived in the Harding Road house all of his life, save for a stint in the U.S. Coast Guard during World War II. In fact, he had been born in the house in 1909. A well-known financier and sports car enthusiast, Wilson was also a leading social figure in the city, having been president of the Nashville Bachelors Club. I don't really know what that is, but it makes me want to do a little more research into it later. It is John B. Wilson's body that Larry Brinton sees inside the bedroom, sprawled on the floor face up with its feet pointing at the side of one of the two twin beds. He's still fully dressed, save for his suit coat, and a large blood stain circles the front of his starched white shirt. There is also a pool of red beneath him and a smudge on the bed nearest the doorway. Detective Hicks is the first to speak. "You ain't gonna believe this, Doc," he says. "His wife killed him with a samurai sword." A samurai sword. Let's linger on that for just a minute before we get into the details of the rest of this particular crime. Now, plenty of people are stabbed to death each year in the U.S. In perusing the stats from 2021, it appears that over 1,000 people died by stabbing. Guns are, of course, far more common. Less than 10% of all murders involve knives, but 1,000 people per year is not insignificant. If you go back to the years 2015 to 2020, it's 30% higher, topping out at about 1,500 murders per year via knife. And I don't think that statistic includes all of the accidental stabbings and cuts and things like that. With all that in mind, it's almost impossible to know how many people are killed by sword in any given year in the United States. The key is the number is not zero. Most of the data that I managed to gather is anecdotal, and the stories themselves are crazy, but they do exist and they're pretty horrifying. In 2010, when an actor named Michael Bria, most famous for his role in the TV series Ugly Betty, killed his mother with a 3-foot Masonic blade, he claimed that he didn't kill her, just the demon inside her. Men, mostly men, have used katanas to slice off fingers during street fights, attempt to behead their parents, and kill complete strangers due to an unhealthy obsession with the movie Highlander. These are facts that I managed to find in cases that really exist. Anyway, it's rare but not completely unheard of, and especially not in Belmead. Sword murders just don't happen there. Belmead is the area of Nashville where the upper crust, the creme de la creme, live, and something so scandalous and so odd is really strange, especially to happen there. The purported assailant of this crime in April of 1963 is 42-year-old Jean Beasley Cochran Wilson, John B. Wilson's wife. A Southern socialite of the highest order, she is the daughter of Virginia Taylor Beasley and George Holland Beasley, a family famous for creating the Beasley Furniture Company in downtown Nashville. I say that only to underscore just how unexpected it is for such a gruesome crime to occur in Nashville's upper echelon. Let's get into the details of what happened that night, at least according to the witnesses. The night of the incident, Wilson and Cochran attend a party hosted by attorney James O. Bass at his home on Chickering Lane. He recalls seeing Wilson playing billiards and that even though the couple was the last to leave, he doesn't recall Wilson being overly intoxicated. They arrive home a little after 2 a.m., and Cochran goes to see her son, William, in his bedroom. William is her 20-year-old son from a previous marriage, and he and his stepfather have a strained relationship, to say the least. He works at the Redstone Arsenal Army Outpost down in Huntsville, and would only come home on the weekends because of the constant verbal abuse from his stepfather, John B. Anyone with even a passing knowledge of the family knew about the rancor between the two men. On this night, when Jean goes into her son's room to say, "Good night," all of that, John follows, seemingly gearing up for a fight. According to William, the son, he immediately started getting on me about something. This is a direct quote. He was always getting on me about something. It definitely doesn't seem like a healthy home environment, and situations are always inflamed in the presence of alcohol. And this is the moment where things go haywire. Jean Wilson would later tell investigators that as her husband continued sniping at her son, she leaped onto the bed, pulling a 28-inch samurai sword from its place on the wall. The sword itself was a gift from William's father, who had given it to him 2 years earlier. I can't remember where I saw this information, but I believe that the sword was from his father's being stationed somewhere in Japan, if I'm not mistaken. Jean Wilson would also claim the gesture was an attempt at humor, a way of edging her husband back into his room without further inciting his ire. For those of you who don't believe that grabbing a bladed instrument as a joke would end in anything but tragedy, just bear in mind that they've been drinking all night, and sometimes people don't always think to the best of their ability when in the throes of a, pretty good binge. Ironically, I can identify with this behavior too. I grew up in a split household, and humor was always my go-to means for defusing tense and often uncomfortable situations. I'd often do or say anything to keep the mood up, even when things were at their grimmest. So I can totally understand someone doing this to curtail a spate of verbal and emotional abuse. And at this point, I'm going to quote directly from the Nashville Scene article that comprises the bulk of the research for this episode. Quote, trying to impersonate the late swashbuckling movie star Douglas Fairbanks. Jean Wilson said she plunged the tip of the 28-inch sword blade into a decorative pillow at the head of the bed. Then she claimed she swirled around with her sword, a la Fairbanks, and at that very moment, her husband lunged toward her. 5 inches of the blade plunged into her husband's chest, piercing his heart. Within minutes, Wilson was dead. As John B. lay dying, Jean Wilson rushes to the telephone. Oddly, she doesn't call the police or an ambulance. Rather, she phones the family physician, Dr. F. Tremaine Billings, who rushes to the home. By the time he arrives, he can offer little help because Wilson was already dead. But Billings does set in motion Jean Wilson's legal defense. He calls John Hooker Sr., one of the city's top criminal lawyers, and also notifies police. Hooker, a courtly gentleman known across the South for his criminal defense talents, drives into Nashville from his Franklin home, arriving just minutes after detectives Castleman and Hicks. Hooker immediately closets himself with Jean Wilson. Unfortunately, the detectives had already picked up some evidence that could prove incriminating to Jean Wilson. Shortly after Castleman arrives, he has a conversation with Billings, the family doctor. And the doctor did not mince words. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson had an altercation, and she killed him. End quote. Following the advice of the lawyer, Hooker, however, both Jean Wilson and William Cochran refused to give the police any statements about the incident. By this time, she had changed out of her blood-stained evening dress. As investigators begin wrapping up their investigation in the bedroom, a hearse from Bracy Welch Funeral Home sweeps in the driveway and pulls in behind the darkened residence. Meanwhile, as Larry Brinton stands at the top of the stairs, he could see Hooker and John Cole, the district attorney investigator, commence a legal tap dance that he knew would grow into a matter of intense public interest. I'll bring Miss Wilson to the district attorney's office on Monday, Hooker tells Cole. But Cole won't buy it. Mr. Hooker, she's going downtown this morning. I'm charging her with murder. Those are just my stock Southern accents. No one I really have ever met actually talks like that, but I think we all fall into a bit of fanciful, carefree dialogue when assuming the role of a 1950s Southerner. The veteran lawyer shakes his head in disbelief, then disappears back behind the bedroom door to give his client the bad news. The wheels of justice in this case turn quickly. Just 4 hours after her husband's death, Jean Wilson appears before Night Court Judge Daniel Boone. And no, that's not a typo. As if in a daze, she speaks quietly with her lawyer. She then turns to Cole and says, "You mean I'm charged with murder?" Assured though she is, the attractive graying mother of 3 says nothing else. Hooker enters an innocent plea on her behalf, and she is then released from custody on a $2,500 bond posted by Billings, the family lawyer. News of Wilson's death and his widow's arrest spread quickly. Headlines scream across the top of that day's banner. John B. Wilson dies from wound. Wife faces charge. A photograph shows Castleman, the detective, holding the infamous sword. Friends rush to the Wilson residence to offer assistance to Jean Wilson. The medical examiner determines that John Wilson, described by friends as a, quote, heavy weekend drinker, died in about 3 minutes from blood loss. Private funeral services are held 2 days later at the Wilson home, with the burial occurring at Mount Olivet Cemetery. The day after the funeral, Jean Wilson, accompanied by Hooker and other members of the family, go to the offices of District Attorney General Harry G. Nickel on the 6th floor of the courthouse. There, Hooker begins sketching out what amounts to a legal defense strategy. To Hooker, the affair was an accident, he would later tell newspapers. Jean Wilson did indeed have the sword in her hand, but she did not have any intent of doing any injury to him. Unfortunately, Hooker says, Wilson lunged into her. And as everyone already knew, the consequences were unfortunate and dire. Other than Jean herself, there are no eyewitnesses to the alleged murder. Cochran, the stepson, tells officials he didn't see his mother impale Wilson with the sword. While his stepfather was berating him, Cochran says he turned away from the abuse of Wilson. The only person who truly knows what happened, therefore, is the woman being charged with the murder. Investigators fan out into the community of Belmead to ask questions about Wilson. For starters, they want to know how much Wilson had to drink at the party. They seem to get two different answers. Jean Wilson said her husband was, quote, tight, while Bass, the party host, said he saw nothing remarkable about the intoxication of the couple when they left the home. Meanwhile, Nickel, the county district attorney, tells reporters he was somewhat, quote, disappointed at not getting more information from the man's family, end quote. He places Assistant District Attorney Paul Bumpus in charge of the investigation. As the probe continues, the questions being asked by scores of people across the city, not to mention the couple's neighbors in Belmead, only multiply. Was it an accident? Did Mrs. Wilson murder her husband over his treatment of her son? Did her son stick the sword into his stepfather's chest, letting his mother take the blame? It wasn't a case that was going to be easy to prove. What about fingerprints on the sword? Dr. Cora, the medical examiner, says it was impossible to lift fingerprints from the handle of the sword because of its spiral-shaped handle. Also, why wasn't the bed coverlet in disarray if Jean Wilson jumped on the bed and clowned around with the sword before stabbing her husband? Investigators called to the scene did not find anything in disarray. Finally, something else raises suspicions with John Cole, the district attorney investigator. Quote, if Miss Wilson was standing on the bed and her husband on the floor, the blade of the sword would have entered his body on a downward angle, end quote. But the medical examiner rules that the blade entered Wilson's body on a straight line. This implies that she was not, in fact, on the bed, but standing parallel in front of her husband. Or maybe someone else was standing in front of her husband when John B. Wilson was stabbed. To those seeking answers, hope arrives. On May the 24th, the Davidson County Grand Jury begins an investigation into the murder by calling 11 witnesses for testimony. Cole of the DA's office is the first to testify. Reporter Larry Brinton is the second. Others include Detectives Castleman, Hicks, and Luke Stewart, police officers James Bird and Henry Parrish, George Curry, an investigator for the district attorney, James O. Bass, whose party the Wilsons had attended, and Joseph Eckert of Bracy Welch Funeral Home. Now, of everything to consider, the grand jury's options include 1, indicting Jean Wilson for first-degree murder, 2, second-degree murder, 3, voluntary manslaughter, 4, involuntary manslaughter, or 5, assault. Or the final option is it could return what is called a not true bill, meaning there is insufficient evidence to bring her to trial. The one thing that complicates the issue, the lack of witnesses, is also the one thing that works out against prosecution, which is why it should probably not come to a surprise that the grand jury hands back a not true bill. No trial, no resolution, no nothing. So the case kind of ends with a whimper. There is no tense struggle between the two sides in the case, no long soliloquies from foghorn leghorn attorneys. Just a vote of no confidence, essentially. And essentially, that's where the story ends, at least officially. People in the neighborhood of Belmead get kind of what they want, which is rampant speculation, and there is nothing that is more wonderful in a wealthy neighborhood than rampant speculation. The question itself will probably always remain. Did Jean Wilson murder her husband? Was it a horrible accident? Or was she covering up for her son, William Cochran. You don't really come to this podcast for speculation, and I usually don't offer it. But speculation is all we really have in this situation, so I'll engage in a teeny tiny bit of it. The theory to me that it was an accident just doesn't really play. When you consider the angle of entry on the sword, it seems highly unlikely that she was on the bed, let alone telling the complete truth about the stabbing, which leaves one of two options. Either she killed John B. in the heat of passion during an argument, perhaps out of a kind of fury over her son's treatment, or two, William Cochran killed John B. Wilson himself out of anger over being constantly verbally tormented by his stepfather. The truth always matters, and I like to get to the bottom of it, but I'm no investigative journalist, so I'll just kind of have to leave the story here. As for whatever happened to the samurai sword, Ritter, the Tennessean reporter, was apparently promised it by Harry Nickel, the district attorney general. But the newspaper reporter never got it before Nickel left office. Instead, Hollins, the prosecutor, ended up with it. That was because Hooker, Gene Wilson's lawyer, did not want the weapon to be returned to members of the Wilson family. So on Hooker's recommendation, it went to Hollins. But Hollins says he only had it briefly. A member of Wilson's family contacted Tom Shriver, who succeeded Nickel as district attorney, and wanted the sword. According to Hollins, quote, Shriver sent Charles Hunter, one of his investigators, to pick it up so it could be turned over to the family member, Hollins said. To this day, 60 years after the crime took place, Nashvillians still occasionally discuss the case. George Curry, a retired Metro police major who was an investigator in the district attorney's office at the time of Wilson's death, remembers investigators speculating that William Cochran, not his mother, might have stabbed his stepfather. Frank Ritter, the reporter for the Tennessean who followed the case, and others, including Larry Brinton, had the same suspicions. Cochran, who was only 20 at the time of his stepfather's death, is now an old man. After working as a dredge boat captain in northern Alaska, he recently returned to Nashville to make it his home. Although he would like to forget the deadly night of April 6, 1963, he hasn't erased it from his mind. It was all very embarrassing, he remarked in a recent phone conversation. He described the event as tragic and very unfortunate. It's been a long, long time, he said, adding, you have to get on with your life. To those who believed he was the one who actually stabbed his stepfather, Cochran said, there were all kinds of rumors. And, not surprisingly, he is adamant about his own innocence. Asked if he stabbed his stepfather, he replies firmly, no, I didn't. As for whatever happened to the woman charged with the murder, Jean Wilson moved to Memphis after her husband's death and married John High School, the Shelby County District Attorney. He later died of cancer. She married for a fourth time, moved to Chattanooga, and that's where she passed away a few years ago. And with that death, the case sort of ends. And I know that in true crime circles, it's really important to have closure. It gives us a sense of completeness, and I just can't offer it in this case. And I think what you can do is have someone listen to the episode or talk about the case with them and discuss what you think actually happened. Maybe if you live in Nashville, ask an older relative if they remember this case and what they think happened and if they know any gossip about it, because the only thing that lives longer than a true crime case that doesn't get solved is rumors about true crime cases that don't get solved. So, with that, I think we will finish up this episode of Music City Murder. Thank you guys for listening, and as always, don't forget to go subscribe to the podcast and give it a rating and a review on your favorite podcasting app, whether it's Stitcher or Overcast or Downcast or the Apple Podcast app or what have you. This is your host, Tyler, signing off, and I hope that you guys have a wonderful March and spring break, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of Music City